Picture this. Los Angeles, 1968. A Saturday night somewhere in South Central. There are maybe 10,000 people packed onto a blocked-off section of public road. And the LAPD is there too. Not to shut it down, not to make arrests, but to help run the thing. They're blocking intersections. They're keeping order. And standing in the middle of all of it is a 6 feet 6 inches, 300 pounds Vietnam veteran in full military fatigues and a green beret who somehow convinced the city of Los Angeles that drag racing was the answer to gang violence. That man was William Big Willie Andrew Robinson III. And his story is one of the genuinely strange and genuinely great stories in American motorsports history. Not because he built the fastest car or won the most races, though he did race a 556 cubic inch Keith Black Hemi-Charger Daytona that would have made your eyes water, but because he figured out something that police departments and city governments and academics hadn't figured out. That if you give people who are about to kill each other a better thing to do with that energy, sometimes they'll take you up on it. This is Legacy Engines, and I spend way too much time thinking about the forgotten figures who shaped American car culture from the ground up. If you're someone who loves the real history behind motorsports, the stories that never made it into the official record books, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Here's the thing about Big Willie Robinson. The Brotherhood of Street Racers, at its peak, had over 80,000 members across 38 states and 9 countries. They had a drag strip on a decommissioned Navy airfield between San Pedro and Long Beach where Crips and Bloods and Mexican Mafia members and skinheads and suburban kids all showed up on the same night and raced each other instead of shooting each other. Dodge eventually named a limited edition muscle car after him. The LA Times produced a 7-part investigative podcast about his life. And he died in 2012 having barely made the history books. So let's fix that. Robinson was born September 12, 1942 in New Orleans, Louisiana. The eldest of 5 children in a family that understood from day one what it meant to live in a segregated America. He was big even as a kid, the kind of physically imposing presence that made people pay attention. And when he was old enough, he decided he was going to play college football. In 1960, he enrolled at Louisiana State University with that plan. LSU wouldn't put him on the team. His race was the reason. That was just how it worked. Then one day, he came out of class and found his car, a 1953 Oldsmobile 98 that his father had given him, something he was genuinely proud of, sitting there with the headlights smashed, the windows broken, and the tires slashed. White students who didn't want him there made sure he knew it. Robinson left Louisiana and didn't go back. He went to Los Angeles, and that decision, made in anger and pain on a campus parking lot, is where this whole story starts. He enrolled at UCLA and started racing. Got a 1957 Oldsmobile and found the underground drag racing scene that was running all over East LA and South Central in the early 1960s. Illegal, dangerous, loud, and absolutely alive with community and competition. This is where Robinson made his name. He wasn't just fast, he was charismatic, and he was enormous, and he had a way of commanding a space that went beyond his physical size. People paid attention to him. Then in 1964, the Army drafted him. He went to Vietnam as a Green Beret, reportedly among the first Black Americans to serve in that unit, though that's Robinson's own account and hasn't been independently confirmed. He served and he came home with a medical discharge in 1966, and he landed back in a Los Angeles that looked completely different from the one he left. The Watts riots had happened in 1965. 34 people dead, over 1,000 injured, $40 million in property damage. The neighborhood was traumatized. Federal investment had already been declining for years, and it was about to get worse. Here's what most people don't realize about this era. Federal funding to cities went from roughly 18% of city budgets in 1977 down to about 2% by 1985. That's not a gradual squeeze. That's a collapse. Factories were closing. Jobs were disappearing. And into that vacuum, the early Los Angeles street gangs were filling a need for belonging and structure and protection that the government had stopped providing. The Crips didn't exist yet when Robinson got back. They formed around 1969. The Bloods came together in 1972. Robinson was watching this happen in real time. And he understood something about it that a lot of outsiders missed. That the energy driving young men toward gang life and toward street racing was the same energy. It was about proving yourself. It was about status and community and the thrill of competition. The question was just where you pointed it. So he started pointing it at drag racing. The first events were informal. Robinson organizing street races in neighborhoods like Compton and Inglewood and Watts, getting people to show up and compete instead of fight. A 1966 LA Times West magazine article identifies him as a promoter of street races around 43rd and Vermont. That's the earliest major press coverage we have of him. And the interesting thing is that the LAPD noticed what he was doing before he'd even officially organized anything. Officers started showing up at his events, undercover at first, watching. And what they saw was that these gatherings were calming things down rather than stirring them up. When Robinson had a racing event going, the surrounding neighborhood was quieter. The math was pretty simple once you saw it. By 1968, the LAPD made it official. Captain Frank Bond and other officers began actively blocking off mile-long sections of public roads so the Brotherhood could run all-night racing events with police support. First night drew over 10,000 people. Second night doubled that. Paul Norwood, who became the Brotherhood's executive vice president, explained the department's thinking. There was a lot of tension in the city, and the police thought racing was a good way for people to get rid of their anxiety and anger on weekend. You've got to sit with that for a second. The LAPD in 1968, not exactly a department known for its warm relationship with South Central LA, saw what Robinson was building and decided to help. That tells you something about how visible and immediate the violence reduction effect was. Now, you might be thinking, okay, street races with police support, that's interesting, but how long could something like that actually last? And here's where Robinson's operation gets genuinely interesting from a motorsports perspective. Because the answer is, with the right people behind it and the right philosophy driving it, it lasted nearly 3 decades. To understand why Robinson's events worked the way they did, you need to know what the SoCal drag racing landscape looked like in the late 1960s. This was the golden age for the sport out here. You had Lions Drag Strip down in Wilmington, an NHRA-sanctioned facility that the locals called the Beach, one of the greatest quarter-mile strips in America, which had been running since 1955. You had Pomona Raceway at the LA County Fairgrounds where the NHRA held the Winter Nationals. San Fernando Drag Strip up in Pacoima. Orange County International Raceway down in Irvine. More than 20 strips operating at various points across the region. But here's the problem. Lions closed in 1972. San Fernando closed in 1969. And the facilities that remained, Pomona, OCR, were 30 to 40 miles from South Central Los Angeles and operated within the formal NHRA framework. Higher entry fees, strict vehicle classification, extensive technical inspection, full proper race-prepared cars with fire suits and roll cages, and all the professional infrastructure that goes with that. Robinson was serving a community that wasn't coming to Pomona on Sunday. He was serving people who showed up in their street cars, their daily drivers, their half-built project cars. And he needed a format that worked for them. So the Brotherhood ran under its own rules. No NHRA affiliation, no strict classification. The policy was straightforward. Run what you brung. Show up, pass a basic safety inspection, pay $10, and race whoever you wanted. That philosophy attracted everything. Stock Pintos lined up next to Chevy Camaros, lined up next to purpose-built drag cars. Multi-generational families showed up. Gang members showed up. Suburban kids made the drive. People who had never spoken to each other in their lives found themselves in the staging lanes arguing about gear ratios and carburetor jetting and whether the Chrysler 440 was really as good as the Chevy 454. And that conversation, that completely normal, completely human car guy conversation, was doing something that community programs and government initiatives had been failing to do. It was finding common ground across lines that Los Angeles had decided were permanent. Look, you can spend millions of dollars on community outreach programs, on sensitivity training, on policy initiatives. Or you can put two guys with nothing in common except they both think their car is faster than yours into adjacent staging lanes and let physics settle the argument. Robinson figured that out intuitively before anyone had a framework for it. Robinson was driving during all of this himself, which matters because it established his credibility. You can't tell people to trust the process if you're not out there competing. His personal race cars were three 1969 Dodge Charger Daytonas, and if you know anything about these cars, you understand what kind of statement that was. The Charger Daytona is already one of the most extreme production cars ever built in America. Dodge designed it specifically for NASCAR superspeedway racing. Gave it that wild nose cone that extended the front end by 18 inches and that towering rear wing that stood almost 2 feet above the deck lid. The aerodynamics were so effective that it became the first production car to officially break 200 miles per hour at Talladega in 1969, driven by Buddy Baker. Only 503 were ever built for street sale because NASCAR's homologation rules required a minimum production run. Robinson got 3 of them. His primary car, the orange one that became his signature, started life as our 4 Red before getting repainted and was eventually powered by a 556 cubic inch all-aluminum Keith Black Racing Hemi engine paired with a B&M Clutchflight, which is a racing conversion of the Chrysler TorqueFlite automatic with manual valve body control. The body was acid-dipped, which means the metal was chemically treated to remove material and reduce weight, a technique that was pretty radical for a street-based racer. Under the fiberglass hood, a label read African Elephant, which was a reference to the engine displacement. King was painted on the rear tail stripe. Brotherhood logos on the doors. Keith Black Racing Engine's emblems on the fenders. The car was a moving billboard for everything Robinson was building. Here's what most people don't realize about Tamiko Robinson. She was not just a spouse who showed up at events. She was a co-founder of the Brotherhood, its organizational backbone, an active racer, the person who kept the administrative and logistical side of the operation functioning while Robinson worked the crowds and cultivated the relationships that made everything possible. Her green Daytona had Queen on the tail stripe. Willie was king. Tamiko was queen. The cars were a matched set and so were the people driving them. The third car, an off-white one, 440 cubic inch, numbers matching, functioned as a promotional vehicle, though damage to the differential snubber plate from hard launches suggests it saw more track action than Robinson officially admitted. These things happen. Getting the Daytonas prepared to race level meant connecting with Keith Black Racing Engines in South Central LA, and that relationship was crucial. Keith Black was one of the greatest Hemi engine builders in history. His shop built power plants for some of the most successful top fuel and funny car programs in NHRA history. And his support gave Robinson's cars legitimate credibility in the drag racing community. American Racing Equipment sponsored Robinson as well and reportedly sold Big Willie posters by mail order, which is a detail that tells you how much name recognition he had built outside South Central by the early 1970s. And this is where the cultural reach of what Robinson was building starts to become really clear. Because by the early 1970s, he wasn't just known in South Central or even just in Los Angeles. He was becoming a figure in the broader American car culture conversation. And he had the cars to back it up. A 556 cubic inch Keith Black Hemi in an acid-dipped Charger Daytona is not a community outreach project. That is a serious racing machine piloted by a serious competitor who happened to also be running one of the most remarkable social experiments in American urban history on the side. This is where it gets really interesting, because Robinson's two identities, the racer and the community builder, weren't separate things operating in parallel. They were the same thing. His credibility as a competitor was what gave him the authority to stand between two gang leaders who were about to kill each other and be taken seriously. You don't get that authority from a government title or a non-profit charter. You get it from showing up, strapping in, and going faster than everyone else while the whole neighborhood watches. Robinson understood that instinctively in a way that no policy framework has ever fully captured. Now, here's where the logistical story gets complicated. Running pop-up street events with police support worked for a while, but Robinson wanted something permanent. A real facility. A place the Brotherhood could call its own. And getting there took a fight. The pop-up events eventually got banned. The LA Times podcast describes this happening in the early 1970s, which is when Robinson pivoted to the mission of building an actual drag strip. He needed land. He needed political support. And he needed money he didn't have. What he had instead was an extraordinary network of influential people who believed in what he was doing. The most important was Tom Bradley. Bradley became Los Angeles's first black mayor in 1973, an election that itself was a seismic event in the city's political history. And he understood exactly what Robinson was building and why it mattered. In 1974, with Bradley's direct support and the cooperation of the LA Harbor Commission, Brotherhood Raceway Park opened on a decommissioned Navy airfield on Terminal Island, the industrial strip of land that sits between San Pedro and Long Beach, right where the LA and Long Beach harbors meet. The facility was not fancy. A quarter-mile concrete drag strip, guardrails borrowed from the Long Beach Grand Prix circuit, rent of $1,000 a month to the Harbor Commission, entry fee of $10 after passing a basic safety check. Sports Illustrated visited in 1994 and described it as several acres of asphalt, a line of cracked barricades, and a Pima flag popping in the sea breeze. That's what it looked like. That's also what it was. And it was exactly what it needed to be. Bradley publicly endorsed the track in 1977. It provides not only an opportunity to give these youngsters an outlet, but it helps build brotherhood. The man understood what he was looking at. Robinson's other great civilian ally was Otis Chandler. If you're not immediately placing that name, Chandler was the publisher of the Los Angeles Times during its greatest era, a multimillionaire heir to the Chandler family media empire and a genuine car enthusiast who collected rare automobiles. He wore Brotherhood clothing. He wrote endorsement letters for Robinson. He used his influence and his platform to support the program for decades. When you've got the mayor and the publisher of the LA Times in your corner, you can get things done in Los Angeles. And Robinson had both. What Robinson was doing at Terminal Island by the mid-1970s was genuinely unprecedented. He had built a neutral zone in one of the most gang-divided cities in America. And he was running it on the principle that competition on the track replaced competition in the street. Brotherhood member Kenneth Tex Russell put it this way. You could be the Ku Klux Klan. You could be the Aryan Nation. You could be the Crips. You could be the Bloods. When you come around Willie, all that stopped. That's not hyperbole. That's what people who were there witnessed. The enforcement mechanism was partly physical. Robinson at 6 feet 6 inches and close to 300 pounds was genuinely difficult to argue with. And partly structural. Gang colors were banned. Alcohol and drugs were banned. The Brotherhood rules required members to pledge to race safely and refrain from violence both at events and while traveling to and from them. But the deeper enforcement was social. Robinson had personal relationships with gang leadership across the city. And those relationships meant there were gang leaders actively invested in keeping events peaceful because they'd told Robinson they would. He described it in a Discovery Channel special. I've had top gang leaders tell me, Willie, you give us a place that we can hang out, race, and have fun, we'll help you keep the peace. Tookie Williams, co-founder of the Crips, is documented attending Brotherhood events. That's how far the relationships went. Paul Norwood, the Brotherhood's executive vice president, talked about watching Robinson defuse situations that were about to turn fatal. Big Willie could go up to gang members from 2 different gangs who were ready to kill each other and have them put down their weapons. That's not a program. That's a person. And it worked because of who Robinson was, not because of a protocol he was following. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so he had a big personality and some powerful friends. Plenty of people have that and don't accomplish anything lasting. And that's a fair objection. Here's the thing though. What Robinson built wasn't dependent on grants or government contracts or institutional goodwill that could be withdrawn at the next budget cycle. It was dependent on relationship, on the fact that he had personally looked gang leaders in the eye and made them a promise and kept it, on the fact that he was out there every weekend, not sending a representative, not delegating the hard conversations, but physically present, personally accountable. That kind of trust takes years to build, and it's almost impossible to replicate through any formal institutional mechanism. Which is exactly why nobody has successfully replicated it. The hostility Robinson encountered at the track wasn't only from gang members. The broader drag racing community wasn't always welcoming to what he was building. But he had a way of handling that too. Brotherhood member Fabian Ao recalled watching people call Robinson racial slurs directly to his face and watching Robinson respond with patience. He just hit them with kindness, Ao said. Disarming hostility through refusal to mirror it. Doing that consistently over years in a city with as much tension as Los Angeles requires a kind of sustained personal discipline that's genuinely hard to describe. And it produced results that are genuinely hard to argue with. Here's what most people don't realize about the LAPD relationship with Brotherhood Raceway Park. It didn't stay informal. It deepened over time into something formalized and operationally significant. By 1994, LA County Sheriff's Deputy Sergeant Bill Chaffin, a SWAT team member who was also a professional racer, formed an official partnership with Robinson to use drag racing as a violence reduction tool. Chaffin would eventually produce a 2013 documentary short about their collaboration. Former LAPD Chief Bernard C. Parks acknowledged what the program accomplished. He did a lot to get kids off the street. Anytime you're dealing with prevention, you can't count how many lives were saved, how much damage was prevented. A retired deputy sheriff was more blunt about it. Pretty much all the cops knew when Willie's track is open, it definitely makes a difference. Virtually all the street racing stopped because now they had a place to go. Think about what that means from a pure public safety economics standpoint. One man with a quarter-mile strip of concrete and a $10 entry fee was accomplishing something that millions of dollars in formal policing and community programming had failed to accomplish. And the mechanism was so simple it almost sounds made up. Give people a place to compete legitimately and they'll stop competing illegally. LA Police Commission President Steve Sabaroff had perhaps the most direct summary of Robinson's function in the city's ecosystem. Big Willie was a service provider. Just like Big Brothers is, just like the YMCA is, so was Big Willie. Big Willie was an off-ramp to the freeway to jail. That framing matters because it gets at something important about why Robinson's work hasn't been more formally studied or replicated. He was providing a genuine public service without a government contract, without an academic framework, without a formal budget. He was just doing it because he understood it worked and because he cared about whether the people in South Central Los Angeles lived or died. This is where it gets really interesting, because the Brotherhood's growth during this period wasn't just local. Robinson was taking his model on the road. The Brotherhood grew to over 80,000 members in 38 states and 9 countries. That growth happened organically through word of mouth and Robinson's own travel. He reportedly took his model to Chicago in 1979 and to New Orleans in later years. No policy paper, no grant proposal, no academic framework. Just a man with a dragstrip philosophy and the personal credibility to make people believe in it wherever he showed up. Robinson had a cultural presence beyond the racing world that's worth understanding because it shows how seriously Los Angeles took what he'd built. He appeared in Tulane Blacktop in 1971, the Monte Hellman road racing film with James Taylor and Warren Oates. His Orange King Daytona is visible during a burnout in the opening scenes. That film is considered one of the great American road movies, and Robinson's car is right there in the middle of it. Not as a prop, not as set dressing, but as a genuine piece of the scene because Robinson was a genuine piece of the scene. That film is also where he met Gary Kurtz, who would go on to produce Star Wars. Through that connection, Robinson organized Star Wars-themed racing events in 1977 and 1980, with Lucasfilm providing character rights. Darth Vader and Boba Fett costumes showed up at Brotherhood Raceway Park alongside Mayor Bradley and Councilman Robert Farrell and gang members from across the city. That's the Brotherhood Raceway Park experience in one image. A man who could put a Star Wars character, a city mayor, and rival gang members all in the same parking lot on the same Saturday night and have all of them leave without anyone getting hurt. Robinson also claimed late in his life that he'd been offered the role of Darth Vader in the original Star Wars. That claim has never been independently confirmed, and the LA Times podcast investigates it skeptically. It appears to be one of the areas where Robinson's self-mythology exceeded documented reality. Look, Robinson was a storyteller and a showman, as well as a community leader. And the line between the legend and the man sometimes got blurry. That's not a criticism exactly. It's an honest observation about someone who understood intuitively that in order to do what he was doing, he needed to be larger than life. And he was, even if some of the specific details of the legend got embellished along the way. And this matters because it's part of what makes Robinson's story genuinely complicated in the most interesting way. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a simple hero. He was a human being with extraordinary instincts and genuine charisma, who built something real out of almost nothing in one of the most difficult urban environments in American history. And the complications don't diminish what he built. They make it more interesting. Here's the thing about Robinson's approach that I find most remarkable when you really sit with it. He anticipated key elements of what later became formal gang intervention frameworks, community mobilization, providing legitimate opportunities for competition and belonging, direct social intervention, by decades. He was doing all of that instinctively without the vocabulary, without the funding, without the infrastructure. The fact that it worked is documented. The fact that nobody studied why it worked or tried to apply it elsewhere in a systematic way is a genuine gap in how American cities think about violence reduction. A gap that exists to this day. The LA Times Larger Than Life podcast, 7 episodes released starting July 9, 2019, reported by staff writer Daniel Miller and produced by the team behind Dirty John, is where Robinson's story gets its most rigorous treatment. The podcast is honest about his mythology building and his contradictions. Episode 5 contains what the producers called a startling revelation about Robinson that secondary sources only gesture at without explaining. Episode 7 examines how his choice to make himself into a legend ends in something complicated. If you want the full picture of who Robinson actually was, that series is where you go. What I can tell you from everything available is this. William Robinson came back from Vietnam to a city that was burning and figured out that the same impulse driving young men toward violence could be redirected toward competition. He built a community out of that insight across nearly 30 years with minimal resources and no institutional support. And at its height, that community crossed every racial and gang line that Los Angeles had convinced itself were permanent. He did it because he loved cars and because he loved people and because he understood intuitively that those two things together could build something that nothing else was building. The King Daytona is in the history books now. The Brotherhood of Street Racers still has chapters. And Terminal Island, the quarter-mile strip where Crips and Bloods and skinheads and 16-year-old Honda drivers all showed up on the same Saturday night and found out they had something in common, it's buried under shipping containers and 40 years of cargo handling. But the story exists, and that's something. Now here's where the story takes a turn that almost nobody who knows about Big Willie Robinson knows about. And this is the part that genuinely changes how you understand his legacy in American car culture. Because what happened to Brotherhood Raceway Park after the mid-1990s isn't just a footnote. It's the origin story of an entire movement that reshaped popular culture worldwide. Brotherhood Raceway Park is now credited as the birthplace of import drag racing. In 1993, a 16-year-old named Stefan Papadakis showed up at Terminal Island with a Honda Civic C and started experimenting with what a four-cylinder Japanese engine could do on the quarter-mile. He and other early import pioneers like Ron Bergenholtz and Javier Gutierrez used the Brotherhood track to develop the techniques and the community that would become sport compact drag racing. The scene that directly inspired the Fast and Furious franchise. That's not a small thing. Think about what that means for a second. Robinson built a space that was deliberately inclusive of any car from any background. Run what you brung. No judgment, no classification, no minimum displacement requirement. And what grew out of that radical openness was an entire movement that changed popular car culture worldwide. The Fast and Furious franchise has generated over $7 billion in global box office revenue. The import tuning scene it drew from transformed automotive retail, aftermarket parts, car journalism, and motorsport in ways that are still unfolding today. And the ground zero for all of that was a cracked asphalt quarter-mile strip on Terminal Island that Big Willie Robinson fought the LA Harbor Commission for years to keep open. That direct line from Robinson's philosophy to a $7 billion cultural phenomenon is real, and almost nobody draws it. Here's what most people don't realize about the track's operational history. Brotherhood Raceway Park didn't just open in 1974 and run smoothly until it closed. The track opened in 1974 and then operated intermittently, closing and reopening a documented 11 times over a 20-year battle with the LA Harbor Commission. The political dynamics were complicated. Every time a new administration or new set of commissioners came in, Robinson had to fight the same fight over again. He organized demonstrations outside City Hall. He brought supporters to Harbor Commission meetings. He built coalitions. After the 1992 LA riots, which killed 63 people and caused over $1 billion in property damage and fundamentally shook the city's belief in its ability to manage racial tension, the LAPD came back to Robinson for help. Mayor Richard Riordan approved a permit renewal. The track reopened in 1993. But the final closure came in 1995, and there's no sugar-coating what happened. The California government converted Terminal Island into a coal handling and shipping container facility. The drag strip was gone. The Brotherhood's fight to get it back, or find a comparable replacement, carried forward after Robinson's death by Donald Gallis and an effort called Project Street Legal, hasn't succeeded as of now. And that ongoing failure to find a permanent replacement tells you something important about how rare the conditions that made Brotherhood Raceway Park possible actually were. You needed a mayor who understood what you were building. You needed a harbor commission willing to rent you industrial land for $1,000 a month. You needed a publisher of a major newspaper in your corner. You needed 30 years of personal relationship building with gang leadership across one of the most complex urban environments in America. Remove any one of those pieces and the whole thing doesn't work. That's not a scalable model in the traditional sense. It's a monument to what one particular person with one particular set of skills and relationships was able to accomplish in one particular city at one particular moment in history. There are also some honest complications to acknowledge about the track's safety record, because this is a complete picture and not a promotional piece. The Brotherhood operated with minimal infrastructure and no governing body oversight. A 1989 California appellate court case, National and International Brotherhood of Street Racers vs. Superior Court, came out of a 1984 incident where a top fuel dragster left the starting line in reverse gear and crashed into nearby shipping containers, causing crippling injuries to the driver. The LA Harbor Commission documented at least 8 separate incidents between November 1994 and January 1995. The track's unsanctioned come-as-you-are approach, the source of both its accessibility and its cultural power, was also the source of its safety limitations. Those two things existed together, and you can't tell this story honestly without acknowledging both. Now, you might be thinking, if the safety record was that complicated and the track closed 11 times, how do we weigh that against the documented violence reduction impact? And that's exactly the right question to ask. Here's the thing. No human institution is without its contradictions. The NHRA-sanctioned tracks that Robinson's events existed alongside had their own incident records, their own liability histories, their own moments where the controlled danger of drag racing became something less controlled. What distinguished Brotherhood Raceway Park wasn't that it was perfectly safe. It was that it was genuinely accessible to people who had no other outlet. And the documented alternative to Brotherhood Raceway Park wasn't a safer, better-funded facility. It was the streets of South Central Los Angeles, which were considerably more dangerous than any drag strip. This is where it gets really interesting from a pure legacy standpoint. Robinson and Tomiko had no children. The Brotherhood was their family. Tomiko died April 29, 2007, and Robinson never recovered. By his final years, his health had deteriorated severely. He ended up living in a van in a Los Angeles parking lot. The man who had hosted 20,000 people on a Saturday night, who had the mayor of Los Angeles and the publisher of the LA Times writing letters on his behalf, who had Dodge name a muscle car after him, spent his final years without a permanent home. He died May 19, 2012, at a care center in Los Angeles. He was 69 years old. His funeral was held June 2 at the Faithful Central Bible Church in Inglewood, and Mayor James T. Butts spoke. Very few will be fortunate enough to do something that changes the life of someone, Butts said to Robinson. You are one. U.S. Representative Janice Hahn entered a tribute into the congressional record on May 30, 2012, calling Robinson one of the greatest ambassadors of hope and racial unity in this country during my lifetime and a truce broker among LA street gangs. Those are not small words. Those are the words people use for figures of genuine historical significance, and they were entered into the permanent record of the United States Congress for a man who spent his final years living in a van. Then in September 2022, Dodge announced the 2023 Charger SRT Hellcat Red-Eye King Daytona, the fifth of 7 last call special editions marking the end of the Hemi-powered Charger generation. Only 300 units produced, finished in Go Mango Orange to match Robinson's original car. 807 horsepower. Dodge CEO Tim Kuniskis called it a tribute to a true icon of muscle car history and acknowledged Robinson's story in the announcement. That's a mainstream American automaker putting a man from South Central Los Angeles on one of their most prestigious limited edition muscle cars. 300 units at a sticker price that put them well into 6 figures. Sold out almost immediately. And the man it honored died living in a van in a parking lot 10 years earlier. Look, I want to sit with that contrast for a moment because I think it's important. There's something genuinely uncomfortable about the gap between the cultural recognition Robinson has received posthumously and the material circumstances of his final years. The Dodge tribute is real and it's meaningful. The congressional record entry is real. The LA Times podcast is real and it's excellent. But all of that recognition came after he was gone. And the question of why a man who demonstrably reduced gang violence across one of America's largest cities, who built an 80,000-member organization across 38 states and 9 countries, who was personally endorsed by multiple Los Angeles mayors, couldn't secure stable housing in his final years is a question worth asking out loud. What's missing from Robinson's story, and this is something worth thinking carefully about, is academic recognition. Despite decades of documented impact on gang violence reduction, crime rates, and community cohesion across a city that has historically been a testing ground for every theory of urban policy, no formal academic study of the Brotherhood model has been produced. No policy paper. No criminology journal article. No urban planning thesis. The recognition came from police chiefs and mayors and a Dodge press release, but not from researchers who might have examined whether the model could be replicated systematically, refined, funded properly, and deployed in other cities facing the same dynamics that Los Angeles faced in the 1970s and 1980s. Here's the thing about that absence. It's not accidental. Formal academic and policy institutions tend to study things that fit within their existing framework. Brotherhood Raceway Park didn't fit any existing framework. It wasn't a nonprofit with a board of directors and audited financials. It wasn't a government program with measurable outputs and quarterly reports. It was a man with a dragstrip and a philosophy and 30 years of personal relationships with people that no government official could have gotten within 10 feet of. The very things that made it work were the things that made it impossible to study using conventional research method. And so it went largely unstudied. And so the knowledge of why it worked died largely with the man who built it. Stefan Papadakis, the 16-year-old with the Honda Civic, who showed up at Terminal Island in 1993, went on to become one of the most successful engine builders in Formula Drift history. His Papadakis racing team has won multiple Formula Drift championships. The import scene he helped pioneer at Brotherhood Raceway Park became a global phenomenon. And Robinson's track, Robinson's philosophy, Robinson's radical insistence that any car and any driver deserved a place at the starting line, is the direct ancestor of all of it. That lineage deserves to be spoken out loud. So here's where we land with William Big Willie Andrew Robinson III. And I want to make sure this final piece actually means something, because it's easy to tell a story like this and walk away feeling good about it without sitting with what it actually teaches us. Robinson didn't have a blueprint. He didn't have a grant. He didn't have an academic framework or a policy mandate or a nonprofit charter. He had a 1957 Oldsmobile, a philosophy about human nature, and the physical presence to make people listen. And out of those ingredients, he built something that reduced gang violence in South Central Los Angeles for nearly 3 decades. Something that the LAPD, the Mayor's Office, the LA Times, the United States Congress, and eventually Dodge Motor Company all formally acknowledged as real and significant. And something that seeded an entire global car culture movement that generated billions of dollars and reshaped how the world thinks about automotive enthusiasm. Here's what most people don't realize when they hear a story like this. The lesson isn't that drag racing saves lives, though the evidence suggests it genuinely did in this specific context. The lesson is about what happens when you take human energy seriously instead of trying to suppress it. Robinson looked at the same young men that city governments and police departments were treating as a problem to be managed and saw something different. He saw competitors. He saw people who wanted to prove themselves and belong to something and feel the specific thrill of being faster than the person next to them. And he gave them a legitimate arena for all of that. The results speak for themselves in a way that 50 years of formal urban policy largely cannot. This is where it gets really interesting on a historical level. Because the story of Brotherhood Raceway Park is ultimately a story about what gets remembered and what gets lost. Dodge remembered. Congress remembered. The LA Times remembered, eventually, in a 7-part podcast produced half a century after Robinson first blocked off a street in Compton and told people to race instead of fight. But the academic record is essentially empty. The policy record is essentially empty. The institutional memory of what Robinson built and why it worked exists almost entirely in the personal recollections of people who were there, many of whom are no longer with us. The King Daytona is gone. The track is gone. Tomiko is gone. Robinson is gone. But the 80,000 people who called themselves Brotherhood members across 38 states and 9 countries, the import racers who found their community on that cracked terminal island asphalt, the gang members who drove home on Saturday nights instead of pulling triggers, they were real. What Robinson gave them was real. And now you know about it,